The night was warm, the kind of late summer evening when Hollywood's neon lights seemed to hum louder than the crickets. Somewhere along Sunset Boulevard, a black Lincoln Continental glided past the bars and clubs, its tinted windows hiding the man inside. He had just done something unthinkable. For months, he'd lived with the quiet dread that comes from knowing secrets too dangerous to say out loud. But now, they weren't just his burden anymore. He'd talked. He'd told someone. And he knew, deep down, there was no taking it back. The man wasn't just any Hollywood hopeful. He was a recognizable face, the kind of actor audiences remembered even if they couldn't always place his name. Handsome, charismatic, and talented, he had been on the verge of breaking into leading roles. But in the city of dreams, success always came with strings. His strings were pulled by people who didn't care about lights, cameras, or applause. They cared about control, about money, about power. And the man they were about to silence had just tugged one string too many. Some say his mistake was arrogance, believing he could expose dangerous men and still keep his life. Others believe it was guilt, eating at him until he had no choice but to speak up. Whichever it was, the result was the same. Within 72 hours of sharing what he knew, he would vanish without a trace. No official goodbye, no farewell to friends, no public statement. Just gone. His story would become one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in Hollywood history, a cautionary tale whispered at rap parties and in late-night diner booths. Because in a city where every deal hides a devil and every smile might be covering a threat, one man's decision to turn on the mob was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. And the explosion was about to be heard from Beverly Hills to Las Vegas. Before he became a ghost in Hollywood's history, Eddie Marino was the kind of actor who made casting directors lean forward in their chairs. Born in Brooklyn in the late 1930s, Eddie had the natural swagger of a street kid and the jawline of a matinee idol. By his early 20s, he'd moved west, chasing the dream like so many others. But Eddie wasn't just another hopeful. He had that elusive quality the industry calls presence. Even in a crowd scene, your eyes were drawn to him. His big break came in a gritty crime drama set in New York, where he played a small-time hustler with a dangerous temper. The role was minor, but Eddie's authenticity turned heads. He didn't just play a hustler, he was one, at least in spirit. What audiences didn't know was that Eddie's performance was informed by personal experience. Back in Brooklyn, he'd grown up around men who wore nice suits by day and carried switchblades by night. His uncles had business connections, though no one in the family ever dared spell it out. Hollywood noticed, and Eddie started getting more work. Guest spots on popular TV shows, bit parts in films, even a supporting role in a major studio production. But with his rising profile came new friends, men from back east who saw Eddie as a potential asset. He could open doors in Los Angeles, get people in rooms they couldn't enter otherwise. And for Eddie, the line between old loyalty and new opportunity started to blur. At first, it seemed harmless. He'd introduce a producer to a guy from New Jersey who was interested in financing. Or he'd make sure a certain actor landed a part in exchange for considerations. The studio execs didn't ask questions, and Eddie didn't offer answers. But slowly, those favors became obligations, then demands. And soon, Eddie found himself doing more for the mob than for his own career. The irony? Eddie had come to Hollywood to escape the shadow of men like that. Instead, he'd brought the shadow with him, and it was growing darker by the day. By the mid-1960s, Hollywood was in the middle of a quiet power shift. The old studio system was crumbling, independent productions were on the rise, and organized crime saw an opening. Movies were expensive to make, cash-heavy, and, most importantly, hard to audit. For the mob, it was the perfect setup. A legitimate business with endless opportunities to launder dirty money. Eddie Marino became their inside man without even realizing it at first. He was charming, well-connected, and ambitious. 3 traits the mob knew how to exploit. They didn't need him to be a kingpin, they needed him to be a door. And Eddie, eager to please both his old friends from Brooklyn and his new Hollywood contacts, kept that door wide open. One of his early arrangements was simple enough. A shady backer financed a small crime film Eddie was cast in. On paper, it looked like a low-budget independent production. In reality, the budget was inflated, the crew padded with associates, and the excess cash quietly funneled back east. The movie itself barely broke even, but that wasn't the point. The money had already been cleaned. From there, the deals grew bolder. Eddie introduced a director in need of funding to a businessman who specialized in short-term loans. He convinced a studio head to hire a certain union crew in exchange for discounted rates. What the studio head didn't know was that the crew's payroll had ghost workers, names that existed only on paper, but still collected checks. The mob's influence seeped into casting, distribution, even theater ownership. Eddie was the perfect go-between because he never looked like a criminal. He was an actor, a familiar face at parties, someone who could sit across from a producer in a tuxedo and talk about art while, in reality, sealing a deal for someone else's pocket. But Eddie wasn't blind. He knew the game he was in, and he knew there was no easy exit. What he didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that one day he'd stop playing by their rules. And that decision would set in motion the chain of events that made him vanish. It happened in 1971 during what should have been the biggest opportunity of Eddie Marino's career. He had just landed a supporting role in a major studio crime drama, a film that, ironically, was partially financed by the same people who had been slipping him envelopes for years. This wasn't just another job, it was his shot at breaking into the top tier of Hollywood. But behind the scenes, the production was a mess. The mob-backed financiers were getting impatient, the studio was tightening its budget, and whispers started spreading that someone on the inside had been skimming from the skim. Eddie knew who it wasn't him, but the way the rumors were swirling, his name was getting pulled into it. That's when the call came. One of his old friends from Brooklyn invited him to a quiet dinner at a Beverly Hills steakhouse. The conversation started friendly, talk of the movie, the box office, mutual acquaintances. But halfway through the meal, the tone changed. They told Eddie there was a problem with the production money, and the solution was simple. He needed to keep his mouth shut and help point suspicion towards someone else. Eddie froze. For years, he'd played the game, smiling through parties, making introductions, collecting his cut. But this was different. This was framing an innocent man, a director who had treated him like family, for a mob mess Eddie hadn't created. Something in him snapped. Instead of going along, Eddie went to the one place the mob never expected, a federal investigator's office in downtown Los Angeles. He didn't tell them everything, not yet, but he hinted at what he knew. Enough to get the agents interested, enough to get word back to the wrong people. Within a week, Eddie noticed a black sedan parked across from his apartment. The same faces started appearing at the same cafes. His phone clicks grew louder. Friends stopped returning his calls. And then came the final warning. An unmarked envelope slipped under his door with just 2 words inside: "Time's up." What Eddie did next would be the bravest and most dangerous move of his life. Eddie's last public sighting was as ordinary as it was chilling. On a crisp March evening in 1972, he was seen leaving his favorite Italian cafe in West Hollywood, wearing the same worn leather jacket he'd had since his early days on set. He stopped to sign an autograph for a young fan, smiled faintly, then walked toward his car. That was the last time anyone could say with certainty they saw him alive. The next morning, his apartment was exactly as he'd left it. Coffee cups still on the counter, a script open on the kitchen table, a neatly folded suit laid out for what looked like an upcoming meeting. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. The only thing out of place was his phone, ripped from the wall, the cord hanging like a silent question mark. At first, the LAPD treated it like a possible runaway case. Hollywood actors were notorious for disappearing on extended retreats when scandals got too loud. But friends pushed back hard. Eddie was days away from starting a new role, and he'd just signed a lease for another year. Running didn't make sense. Then came the more disturbing details. Witnesses reported seeing a black Lincoln Continental idling near Eddie's building the night he vanished, matching the description of cars tied to mob enforcers in LA at the time. One neighbor claimed they heard muffled shouting in the parking lot, followed by the sound of a trunk slamming shut. The police took notes, but strangely, none of those details ever made it into the official missing persons report. Rumors began to swirl that Eddie had been taken to a remote property outside Palm Springs, a known mob hangout. Others claimed he'd been put on a plane under a fake name, disappearing overseas to live under a new identity. But among those who knew how the mob handled problems, the truth was far darker. If Eddie had really talked to the feds, there was no second chance. By summer, the investigation had gone cold. The studio quietly replaced Eddie in the film he'd been working on, editing out the few scenes he had already shot. His name vanished from the credits. It was as if Hollywood itself had agreed to erase him, another unsolved mystery buried under layers of glamour and silence. But years later, one strange clue would resurface, reigniting the mystery of Eddie Marino and what really happened that night. Nearly a decade after Eddie's disappearance, the case had faded into Hollywood's long list of unsolved mysteries, until a strange package arrived at the desk of a retired LAPD detective who'd quietly kept tabs on the case. The package contained an old Polaroid photograph. The image was grainy, the lighting dim, but there was no mistaking the man in the picture, Eddie Marino, looking older, thinner, and visibly scared. He was seated at a wooden table in what looked like a bare motel room. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat in front of him, along with a newspaper folded so the date, August 12, 1978, was clearly visible. It was 6 years after he'd vanished. The photograph had no note, no return address, and no fingerprints. But tucked behind it was something even more unsettling, a faded matchbook from a Las Vegas lounge known for mob connections. The detective immediately sent it for analysis, but nothing conclusive came back. The trail was as cold as ever. Whispers in the industry started up again. Some believed Eddie had been kept alive for years as leverage, possibly forced to work quietly on mob-owned productions under an assumed name. Others suggested the photo was staged, a cruel mob calling card to remind everyone what happened when you crossed them. But there was one tiny detail in the photo that wouldn't let go of the detective's mind. In the corner of the image, reflected in a dusty mirror, was the edge of a film camera, an old Mitchell BNC, the kind used on professional movie sets in the 1960s and 70s. If the photo was real, it meant Eddie might not have been hiding in some dingy motel. He might have been on a set, trapped in plain sight. The detective tried to track down the origin of the camera and the matchbook, but both leads hit dead ends. The Vegas lounge had been demolished and the camera's serial number was scratched out. And just like that, the package, and Eddie's case, slipped back into the shadows. But Hollywood never forgets a mystery for long. And years later, one final shocking lead would come from an unexpected source, someone inside the industry who claimed to know the real story of Eddie Marino's fate. It was the late 1990s when an aging Hollywood set decorator named Lou Bennett decided he had nothing left to lose. Lou had worked on dozens of productions, from low-budget B-movies to lavish studio pictures, and his career had always been steady, though never spectacular. What most people didn't know was that Lou had also been on the payroll of certain unofficial backers who kept some productions afloat and kept certain people in line. In a taped interview for a never-aired documentary, Lou leaned forward in his chair, cigarette in hand, and dropped a name the crew hadn't expected to hear in decades: Eddie Marino. Lou claimed that Eddie hadn't been killed right after turning on the mob. Instead, he'd been quietly reassigned. According to Lou, Eddie was forced into working under a fake name on films financed through mob front companies. His face never appeared on screen again, but his fingerprints, figuratively, were all over the productions. Lou swore he'd seen Eddie on set at least 3 times in the mid-1970s, each time looking more worn down. He was always accompanied by 2 men Lou didn't recognize, but whose presence made everyone else on set keep their mouths shut. The most chilling part? Lou said the photo that surfaced in the late 70s was no accident. It was, in his words, a warning to anyone in Hollywood who thought about biting the hand that fed them. He claimed the set in that photograph was built specifically to look like a rundown motel room, even though it sat inside a closed soundstage on a backlot owned by one of the mob's pet studios. When pressed on why Eddie never escaped, Lou gave a haunted half-smile and muttered, "You can't escape something when every door in town has the same key holder." A week after recording that interview, Lou Bennett died in his sleep. Heart failure, according to the coroner. The documentary never aired. The tapes were boxed up and stored away by the production company, and Lou's claims faded into another whispered chapter of Hollywood lore. Still, his testimony added fuel to the legend. If what Lou said was true, then Eddie Marino didn't just vanish, he was erased in plain sight, a living ghost haunting the very industry he once loved. And just when it seemed the trail had gone cold for good, a startling discovery would drag Eddie's story back into the headlines one last time. In 2011, long after most people assumed Eddie Marino's story was just a Hollywood ghost tale, a storage unit in Burbank was auctioned off to pay overdue fees. The unit's contents seemed ordinary at first: old film reels, yellowed call sheets, and dusty set props. But wedged inside a battered steamer trunk was a metal box locked with a heavy, rusted clasp. The winning bidder, a film memorabilia collector named Grant Walsh, cracked it open, expecting to find rare lobby cards or autographed stills. Instead, he found a stack of photographs neatly labeled in grease pencil. The dates spanned from 1973 to 1978, years after Eddie's supposed disappearance. In one photo, a man with a familiar square jaw and tired eyes was sitting behind a camera crane on a dimly lit set. He wore a baseball cap low over his forehead, but the resemblance to Eddie was unmistakable. More chilling still, each photo featured him working on projects rumored to have been financed through shell companies connected to organized crime. There was also a thin folder of memos typed on onion skin paper, the kind used for carbon copies in the 70s. The memos discussed keeping production on schedule and making sure Marino stays under wraps. One note, initialed only with the letter R, instructed a fixer to move Eddie to the Nevada location immediately after wrapping a film. Grant initially thought he'd stumbled onto a goldmine of collectible scandal, but when he started making calls to authenticate the items, strange things began happening. His emails to certain Hollywood archivists went unanswered. One archivist he did reach warned him that some stories are better left in the can. 2 weeks later, Grant claimed his home was broken into, yet nothing was stolen except the metal box. The police report listed it as a standard burglary, but Grant swore the break-in was no coincidence. The only thing left behind was a single photograph, face down on the kitchen table. When he turned it over, it showed Eddie Marino on a set that had never been identified, standing next to a man whose face was hidden in shadow, but whose outline matched the stocky build of a known mob enforcer from the era. The incident reignited public fascination with Eddie's fate. News outlets picked up the story. Crime podcasts dissected every rumor, and Hollywood insiders began quietly asking each other if maybe, just maybe, Eddie had been right under their noses for years. But if the mob had kept him hidden for decades, where was he now? And why, after all this time, did someone feel the need to make sure his story never fully came out? By the time Eddie Marino's name resurfaced in the 2010s, the lines between fact and legend had blurred beyond recognition. Every journalist, podcaster, and amateur sleuth seemed to have their own theory about what really happened after he crossed the mob. But one particular version, pieced together from Union records, FBI leaks, and whispered recollections from aging Hollywood crew members, stood out as the most chilling. According to this theory, Eddie never truly disappeared in the traditional sense. He didn't end up in a shallow grave outside Vegas or sleeping with the fishes off the Jersey Shore. Instead, the mob had something far more strategic in mind. Eddie's real value wasn't as an actor. By the late 60s, his career had been all but dismantled. His value was as someone who knew both sides of the Hollywood game. He understood the studio system's quirks, the union politics, and the backdoor financing deals. If the mob wanted to keep laundering money through film productions without attracting unwanted FBI heat, Eddie could serve as their behind-the-scenes ghost, quietly managing projects, smoothing over disputes, and ensuring nothing ever got too public. The theory claims Eddie was placed under an arrangement similar to witness protection, but controlled by organized crime, not the government. They moved him between remote film locations, often credited under fake names or not at all. In exchange for his cooperation and silence, he was given a modest but steady income, a safe place to live, and complete invisibility from the public eye. One retired cinematographer even claimed to have worked with a man who could have been Eddie's twin on a low-budget Nevada shoot in the mid-1880s. When asked his name, the man simply smiled and said, "Call me Tom." Later, the cinematographer noticed the same man being quietly driven off set in a black Cadillac with out-of-state plates, never to return. But here's where the theory takes an even stranger turn. Some believe Eddie eventually outlived his usefulness. As younger mob associates took over, the old loyalties faded. Without the powerful backers who once protected him, Eddie became a loose end. The last supposed sighting came from a truck stop waitress in Arizona in 1997. She swore a man in his late 60s, with piercing eyes and a face she couldn't quite place, sat in her section for over an hour, nursing a cup of coffee. Before he left, he told her, "I used to be somebody." Was this Eddie Marino, or just another myth layered on top of an already tangled legend? No one can say for sure. But one thing is certain. If this theory is true, then Eddie didn't just vanish. He became part of the machinery that keeps Hollywood's darkest secrets buried. And if that's the case, somewhere out there, locked away in a vault or gathering dust in a forgotten warehouse, might be the final proof of how an actor turned on the mob and managed to live just long enough for them to decide his fate.